Now let's speak to Colonel Richard Kemp. He commanded British troops in Afghanistan in 2003, but also in relevance to the Middle East situation, Colonel Kemp was a senior advisor on army issues to the British government, during which time he visited Israel a number of times. Hello, good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon.
Very grim mood music, really, coming out of the region from both sides, despite the UN call for an immediate ceasefire. What is your take on whether Israel wants to carry on, wants to keep going until, as it sees, it has finished what it set out to do?
I think Israel has very little choice other than to carry on with its military operations until it reaches the conclusion that it needs, which is to stop Hamas from firing rockets at its people in its territory. It's set out on this operation to do that. And the deaths, the civilian deaths, the military deaths on all sides, of course, are absolutely tragic. But Israel doesn't have any choice apart from to defend its own people. And until arrangements are in place to, not just for Hamas to accept that they must stop attacking Israeli territory, but also so that any such agreement is enforced, until those arrangements are in place, I just don't think that Israel has any choice other than to continue to dominate the area.
And so to what extent does the impact on civilians, on people who have nothing to do with Hamas but live in a heavily populated area so can't escape, to what extent does their fate factor in considerations?
I think I would say, from my knowledge of the IDF and from the extent to which I've been following the current operation, I don't think that there has ever been a time in the history of warfare when any army has made more efforts to reduce civilian casualties and deaths of innocent people than the IDF is doing today in Gaza. When you look at the number of civilian casualties that have been caused, that perhaps doesn't sound too credible. I will accept that. However, Hamas, the enemy that they're fighting, has been trained extensively by Iran and by Hezbollah to fight among the people, to use the civilian population in Gaza as a human shield, and Hamas factor in the use of the civilian population as a major part of their defensive plan. So even though, as I say, Israel, the IDF, is taking enormous steps, and I could tell you about some of those if you're interested, to reduce civilian casualties, it's impossible. It is impossible to stop that happening when the enemy is using them as a shield.
Indeed, and some of that is interesting. I mean, I hope we'd have time to touch on it, but people watching this will think, well, there is also the criticism from UN eyewitnesses who talk of the house where people were advised to move to for safety. 24 hours later, it was bombed by Israel.
Well, of course, I can't really comment on the detail of that. I don't have any of the facts available on that, and I've no doubt that any allegations like that will be looked into very seriously by Israel. And of course the Israeli army operate under a strict code of conduct and are answerable to the Israeli government and the Israeli courts. And if it turned out that there was a deliberate crime committed there, I've no doubt that people would be held to account. But of course it's not just a matter of the IDF trying to prevent casualties in a situation where the enemy is using them as a shield, but it's also war itself, the whole nature of war. Any military commander will tell you this. War is chaos. War is full of mistakes. There's friction all over the place. And if you just take, for example, the way that we operate, our British forces operate in Afghanistan and in Iraq, there have been numerous mistakes there, not just by the British, by the Americans, by all of the forces. And these things do happen. It's a real tragedy. It's very unfortunate, but it's just what happens when you go to war.
Colonel Richard Kemp, perhaps we can speak on this again. For now, thank you very much, Colonel Richard Kemp there. Thank you.
Well, you can find out more about the history of the Gaza Strip online, why the Israelis attacked, how it might all end. You can find out that and much more on our special website there, the address on the screen.